Imagine winning a person in a card game. It was a common enough boast in the smokiest corners of the West, but a thing rarely seen. For Jack, a man walled off from the world by 5 years of profound silence, the bet was a fool's errand, a drunken, reckless impulse. He couldn't hear the taunts or the jeers that pushed him to it. He only saw the cold, dismissive eyes of the man across the table and the still figure of the woman standing behind him. However, winning the hand was the easy part. Taking his prize, a woman they called a Chinese princess, back to his lonely cabin in the Montana timberlands was the beginning of a reckoning he could never have prepared for, a danger that whispered in a world he was no longer a part of. The saloon in dusty Harmony Creek was a cauldron of noise Jack could only feel. He felt the stomp of boots on the floorboards as a low thrum in his bones, the slam of a fist on a table as a sharp jolt through the soles of his feet. He'd lost his hearing to a Confederate artillery shell outside Petersburg, a blast that had stolen the world of sound and left him in a perpetual humming void. Now he made his living as a gunslinger for hire and a trapper, his other senses sharpened to a terrifying degree. He could read a man's intent in the twitch of a muscle, see a lie in the flicker of an eye, and feel the vibration of an approaching horse through the packed earth long before anyone else heard the hoofbeats. His silence made men uneasy, and his speed with the Colt peacemaker at his hip made them respectful. He was a ghost at the table, watching the game of 5-card stud unfold. His opponent was a man named Sterling, a railroad agent with soft hands, a cruel smile, and a pocketful of company money. Sterling was losing badly, and his mood soured with every card dealt. The pot grew, a small mountain of coins and crumpled bills. Finally, Sterling was down to his last few dollars and a gold watch. He sneered, his eyes landing on the woman who stood silently by the saloon door. "I'll see your 100, he slurred, "and I'll raise you. Her." A hush fell. The woman, Leanne, didn't flinch. She was dressed in a simple but elegant white prairie dress, utterly out of place, her black hair in a severe, intricate knot. They called her Sterling's princess, a curiosity he'd had shipped from San Francisco. Jack looked from Sterling's smug face to her still, porcelain features. He saw the faint bruising on her wrist, the terror locked deep behind her dark, watchful eyes. Something cold and protective, an instinct he hadn't felt since the war, coiled in his gut. He slid the rest of his winnings, another $200, into the pot. He laid down his cards. A full house, aces over kings. Sterling stared, his face turning a blotchy red. He slammed his losing pair onto the table and shoved his chair back. "She's yours, then," he spat, as if discussing livestock. "Good luck getting a word out of her. She's as broken as an old pot." Jack stood, collected the money, and walked toward her. The eyes of every man in the room were on them. He stopped a few feet away, just looking. He couldn't hear her breathe, couldn't hear the rustle of her dress, but he could see the tiny, rapid pulse beating in her throat. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod toward the door. For a long moment she didn't move. Then, with a grace that seemed impossible in this grimy place, she walked past him and out into the blinding summer sun. The journey to his cabin was a long, slow exercise in silence. Jack rode his steady mare Bess, while Leanne sat perched on the pack mule, her back ramrod straight. She held a small lacquered box on her lap, her knuckles white. He had tried to communicate with a few crude gestures back in town, pointing to himself and saying his name, the sound a useless rumble in his own chest. He then pointed to her, an unspoken question. She had simply watched him, her expression unreadable. Now, under the vast open sky, the silence between them felt different. It wasn't the oppressive quiet of the saloon filled with unspoken thoughts and judgments. It was a clean, immense silence, broken only by the rhythmic plodding of the animals, a vibration he felt through the saddle leather. He found himself watching her in the reflection of a small hand mirror he sometimes used to see behind him on the trail. She wasn't looking at the scenery. Her eyes were constantly scanning, observing the trees, the quality of the light, the behavior of the birds that scattered before them. She was a hunter, he realized, though not for game. She was hunting for threats, for escape routes. She was a survivor. He was used to being alone. He had chosen this life in the high woods, far from the pitying looks and the frustrations of people who had to shout to be understood. His cabin was his fortress, his silence a shield. But her silence was a weapon, a wall she had built around herself. His was a physical affliction. Hers was a deliberate choice, a refusal to engage with a world that had treated her as property. As they climbed higher, leaving the dusty plains for the scent of pine and damp earth, he felt a strange, unfamiliar pang of responsibility. This wasn't a sack of flour he'd won. It was a person, a woman who looked as fragile as a wild rose, but had eyes filled with ancient steel. When they stopped to water the horses at a creek, he dismounted and offered her his canteen. She hesitated, her eyes flicking from the canteen to his face, searching for something. He simply held it out, his expression neutral. Slowly, she reached out and took it, her fingers brushing his. Her touch was like a spark of static electricity, a brief, surprising connection in a world of total sensory deprivation. She drank, then handed it back, her gaze unwavering. He had brought her into his world of isolation, but he was beginning to suspect she was far more familiar with its harsh landscape than he was. The sun began to dip below the jagged peaks, and the air grew cooler. The shadows of the tall pines stretched across the trail like long, dark fingers. The worst of the journey had not yet arrived. They reached the cabin as twilight bled across the sky, turning the world shades of purple and deep blue. It was a simple, sturdy structure of hewn logs, nestled in a small clearing with a view of the valley below. A thin curl of smoke would normally be rising from the stone chimney, but he hadn't been expecting company. The place looked dormant, empty. Jack slid from the saddle, his joints aching. He helped Leanne down from the mule, his hands briefly circling her waist. She was lighter than she looked, and she stiffened at his touch, pulling away the moment her feet were on the ground. Inside, the cabin was one large room, meticulously clean and organized. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A bed was built into another, with a heavy bearskin for a blanket. A ladder led to a small sleeping loft. It was a man's space, built for solitude and function, not comfort. He lit a lantern, and the warm, yellow light pushed back the shadows. He gestured to the room, a sweep of his arm that he hoped conveyed a welcome. Then he pointed to the loaf of bread and jerky on the table, and then to the loft. "You can sleep up there," he mouthed, the words feeling clumsy and loud in his head. She watched his hands, his face, her expression cautious. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. While he unsaddled the animals and rubbed them down, he watched her from the corner of his eye. She didn't sit. She walked the perimeter of the room, her fingers lightly tracing the log walls, the edge of the table, the cold iron of the wood stove. She was mapping the space, learning its dimensions, its exits. When he came back inside, she was standing by the single window, looking out into the impenetrable darkness of the forest. He took out the small slate and chalk he kept for communicating in town. He wrote, his letters clear and blocky, "You are safe here. My name is Jack." He held it out to her. She read the words, and for the first time a flicker of emotion crossed her face. It wasn't relief, not yet. It was a deep, weary sadness. She looked at him, then at the words, and then back at him. She did not take the chalk to write a reply. Instead, she picked up her lacquered box, held it tight to her chest, and climbed the ladder to the loft without a backward glance. Jack erased the slate, the chalk dust like fine powder on his calloused fingers. He had offered a truce. He could only hope she would accept it. He banked the fire and lay down on his bed, his Colt within arm's reach. He could feel the faint vibration of her movements from the loft above, the soft creak of the floorboards. It was the first time in 5 years that another person's presence had filled the silence of his home. It was not a comforting feeling. It felt like a lit fuse. The first few days were a quiet, tense dance of avoidance. Jack fell back into his routines, a rhythm that had governed his silent life. He rose before dawn, checking the snares and traps he'd set along the game trails. He'd return with a rabbit or a grouse, clean it with practiced efficiency, and cook his meal. Leanne remained in the loft for most of the first day. When she finally descended, she moved with a quiet purpose that unnerved him. She took the water bucket and went to the creek, returning with it full. She found his meager vegetable patch, overgrown with weeds, and began to tend it with a patience he found mesmerizing. She did not speak, she did not look at him for long, but she was a constant, observant presence. They communicated in a developing language of gestures. A nod toward the woodpile meant it needed splitting. A hand on the stomach was a sign of hunger. A finger pointed at the sky could mean rain was coming. He learned to read the subtle shifts in her posture, the tightening of her jaw. She was learning to read him, too. She saw the way he'd scanned the tree line, the way he held himself as if constantly braced for a blow. She saw the deep-seated weariness that never left his eyes. One afternoon, he returned from a long patrol of his territory to find she had taken his torn shirt and was mending it with stitches so fine and even they looked like they'd been made by a machine. He stopped in the doorway, stunned. He had expected her to be a burden, a helpless creature he had to protect. Instead, she was making his world better, more orderly. He felt a flush of something he couldn't name. That evening, as the sun set, he was cleaning his rifle on the porch. The familiar, rhythmic motion was calming. He felt a vibration on the porch floor and looked up. Leanne was standing there, holding a cup of hot water infused with some of the mint she'd found growing by the creek. She offered it to him. He took it, their fingers brushing again. This time, she didn't pull away so quickly. He sipped the mint tea, the warmth spreading through his chest. He looked at her, and for the first time, he gave her a small, genuine smile. She didn't smile back, but the hard line of her mouth softened. It was in that moment he noticed her gaze drift to the side of his head. He had been rubbing his right ear, a habit he wasn't even aware of. It was a phantom itch, a deep, persistent ache that had been his constant companion since the war. Lately, the ache had sharpened into a throbbing pain. He thought it was just the damaged nerves acting up, but the way she was looking at him, with an intense, analytical focus, was different. It wasn't pity. It was the look of a scientist studying a peculiar specimen. What he could not possibly know was that her silence was not just a shield. It was an act of observation. And she had just noticed a critical symptom. The uneasy peace of their cohabitation was shattered a week later. Jack was checking his traps down by the river that marked the edge of his territory when he saw it. A freshly snapped twig on the trail. It was nothing a casual observer would notice, but to him it was a shout. He knelt, his fingers tracing the ground. There they were. Hoof prints from 2 shod horses, not the unshod ponies of the local tribes, and boot prints, heavy, with a worn heel on the left one. He had seen that print before, in the dust outside the saloon in Harmony Creek. It belonged to a man named Finn, one of Sterling's hired thugs. A cold dread, heavy and familiar, settled in his stomach. Sterling hadn't accepted his loss. A man like that, full of pride and cruelty, never did. He saw Leanne not as a person he'd lost, but as an object that had been stolen, and he had sent men to retrieve his property. Jack abandoned the traps and sprinted back towards the cabin, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The silence of the forest, usually a comfort, now felt menacing, full of unseen watchers. He burst into the clearing and saw Leanne outside, hanging his mended shirt on a line she had strung between two trees. She saw the look on his face and froze, her hand still on the wet cloth. He didn't waste time. He strode to the patch of bare earth near the porch and, using a stick, drew two crude figures of men on horseback. He drew a rifle. He pointed down the trail, then back at her, his expression grim. He didn't need words to convey the danger. The color drained from her face. The terror he had seen in the saloon returned, stark and raw. But then something else replaced it. A cold fire ignited in her eyes. This was not new to her. Being hunted was a state of being she understood intimately. She gave a sharp nod, her fear hardening into a diamond-hard resolve. While Jack went inside to check his Winchester, pulling a box of cartridges from under his bed, she did something he didn't expect. She didn't hide. She didn't cower. She marched up the ladder to the loft with a determined stride. He assumed she was looking for a hiding place. He was wrong. A moment later she descended. In her hands was the small, lacquered box he had seen her protect so fiercely. She placed it on the table with a soft click. Her message was clear. Before they fought the men coming for her, there was something else she had to do. The enemy outside could wait. The enemy within had to be dealt with first. Night fell like a black shroud over the forest. The cabin was a tiny island of dim, flickering light in an ocean of darkness. Every creak of the logs, every rustle of leaves Jack could imagine but not hear, felt like an approaching footstep. He sat at the table, the Winchester resting across his knees. The throbbing in his right ear had escalated into an agonizing, blinding pain. It felt as if a hot poker was being driven deep into his skull. He gritted his teeth, his vision blurring at the edges. A cold sweat beaded on his forehead. He could barely focus on the doorway, on the threat he knew was coming. Leanne moved from the shadows. She placed a hand on his shoulder. Her touch was surprisingly firm, insistent. She gestured to the chair by the hearth, away from the windows. Then she pointed to his ear, her expression a mixture of urgency and a strange compassion. He shook his head, trying to wave her off. This was no time for phantom pains. There were real threats just beyond the walls. But she was insistent. She took his hand, her grip strong, and pulled him toward the chair. There was a command in her eyes he found himself unable to defy. He sank into the chair, his head swimming with pain. He had to trust her. At this moment, leaning his head back, he was completely vulnerable, offering her the same trust he would an old army surgeon. She moved the lantern closer, its light illuminating the side of his face. Then she opened her lacquered box. He had assumed it held jewelry or keepsakes. It held neither. Nestled in faded black velvet lay a set of slender, gleaming steel instruments. There were fine-tipped probes, curved needles, and a pair of tweezers so delicate they looked like they could belong to a watchmaker. This was not a box of treasures. It was a surgeon's kit. She picked up the tweezers, the metal glinting in the lamplight. She held them up for him to see, then pointed once more, slowly and deliberately, at his ear. A cold knot of fear and awe formed in his stomach. He was a man who trusted nothing but his own eyes and his own gun. Now, in a dark cabin, with killers lurking in the woods, he was about to let a silent woman he barely knew probe the source of his deepest wound. He looked into her eyes, saw the steady confidence there, and gave a single, slow nod. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the pain and to her. He felt the cold, precise touch of metal as she gently probed the entrance of his ear canal. Then a sharp, invasive pressure, deeper than he thought possible. He flinched, but her hand on his shoulder held him steady. There was a scraping sensation, and then a sickening, unmistakable squirming. A live thing was being pulled from the depths of his head. The sensation was vile, a frantic, wriggling pull from a place no living thing should be. Jack's whole body went rigid. A guttural sound of revulsion caught in his throat. Leanne's grip on his shoulder was like iron, holding him fast. With a final, sharp tug, she pulled the tweezers free. He felt a sudden, shocking release of pressure, as if a cork had been pulled from a bottle deep inside his skull. Leanne moved quickly, dropping the thing from the tweezers into a small glass jar she'd prepared. She sealed the lid tight. In the flickering lamplight, Jack stared at what was now trapped inside. It was a centipede, long and dark brown, nearly 3 inches from end to end. Its dozens of legs were still writhing, scrabbling uselessly against the glass. It was a specific species he had never seen in these mountains, a venomous creature whose bite could cause paralysis and whose presence could deaden the nerves over years. It must have crawled into his ear on the battlefield all those years ago while he lay unconscious and bleeding in the Virginia mud. The cannon blast had done the initial damage, but this creature, secreting its slow poison for 5 years, had finished the job, creating a toxic, festering blockage that had ensured total silence. A wave of intense vertigo washed over him, so powerful he gripped the arms of the chair to keep from falling. The cabin seemed to tilt on its axis. And then, through the roaring in his head, a new sensation pierced the void. A sound. It was tiny, almost imperceptible. A faint, high-pitched hiss. He looked around wildly. It was the candle flame, not 2 feet from his face. He was hearing the candle flame. Then another sound, a soft, rhythmic creak. The floorboards settling under Leanne's weight. He looked at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. She was watching him, her face pale, her breath held. He saw her lips part. And the world exploded. "Can you hear me?" Her voice. It wasn't a vibration in his chest or a movement of her lips he was reading. It was sound, real, textured, beautiful sound. It was softer than he could have ever imagined, with a slight musical cadence. It crashed into him with the force of a physical blow. The silence of 5 years shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. The hiss of the candle, the pop of the embers in the hearth, the frantic beat of his own heart, the rush of blood in his ears. It was a deafening, overwhelming symphony. He stared at her, the woman who had just given him back the world, and the sheer, impossible miracle of it brought him to his knees. Just as the cacophony of his rediscovered senses threatened to overwhelm him, another sound cut through the miraculous noise. It was rough, ugly, and terrifyingly real. "Jack, we know you're in there, you deaf fool. The boss wants his property back." The voice, belonging to Finn, was a harsh bark from the darkness outside. Sterling's men had arrived. The quiet, miraculous moment was over. The brutal reality of their situation crashed down. Jack, still on the floor, felt a surge of pure, cold adrenaline. The sounds were disorienting, a painful sensory overload, but the threat was simple. He pushed himself up, his movements stiff. He grabbed the Winchester, the scrape of the stock against the floorboards deafeningly loud. He looked at Leanne. The fear was back in her eyes, but it was the fear of a cornered wolf, not a helpless lamb. She didn't scream or hide. With swift, silent grace, she moved to the lantern and blew it out, plunging the cabin into near total darkness. The only light was the pale, ghostly moonlight filtering through the 2 small windows. "The back," she whispered, her voice a lifeline in the dark. "There is another one at the back window." He could hear her. He could understand her. It was a tactical advantage he hadn't had moments before. As he moved to cover the front door, she pointed urgently to a loose floorboard near the hearth. He'd forgotten he'd even shown her that. He pried it up, his fingers finding the cold, familiar grip of his spare Colt revolver. He tossed it to her. Her hand closed around it with a surety that stunned him. Where had a princess learned to handle a firearm? A splintering crash echoed through the cabin as the first bullet tore through the wooden door, peppering the far wall. The fight had begun. Jack knelt by the front window, using the sill for cover. He could hear their footsteps now, the crunch of boots on gravel, the muttered curses. "He can't hear us, Finn. Just rush the door," one of them yelled. A grim smile touched Jack's lips. That was their first mistake. He waited, letting the sounds guide him. He heard the heavy thud of a shoulder against the door. He fired the Winchester. The rifle's roar was a physical blow, 1,000 times louder than he remembered, and the smell of gunpowder was sharp and acrid. A scream from outside told him he'd found his mark, but as he worked the lever action, a flash of fire erupted from the side window. A searing, white-hot pain tore through his left forearm. He grunted, stumbling back. "Jack!" Leanne's voice was sharp with alarm. He could hear her moving, the soft pad of her feet as she shifted to get a better angle on the back of the cabin. She was his ears, his second set of eyes. The man outside made another mistake. Believing Jack was wounded and alone, he grew bold. Jack heard the scrape of a boot on the log wall as someone tried to climb up to the window for a clear shot. He fired again, this time without aiming, just pointing the rifle where the sound was. A heavy thump followed. 2 down. The sudden silence that followed was more jarring than the gunfire. Jack's ears were ringing, a high-pitched whine that was almost as bad as the void had been. His arm burned, and he could feel warm, sticky blood soaking his sleeve. He held his breath, listening. He could hear the drip of his own blood hitting the floorboards. He could hear Leanne's ragged breathing from the other side of the room. And he could hear something else. A frantic, desperate scrambling outside, moving away from the cabin. The third man, the one Leanne had warned him about at the back, was making a run for it. He was crashing through the underbrush, his panic making him clumsy. Jack started to move toward the door, to finish it, but then a new sound split the night. It was not a gunshot. It was a sharp, metallic snap, followed by a wet, crunching noise and a scream so full of agony it turned Jack's blood to ice. The man had run blindly into the woods and found one of the heavy, iron-toothed bear traps Jack had set weeks ago and forgotten to check. The screaming cut off into a choked gurgle. Then there was only the sound of the wind in the pines and the chirping of crickets, a sound he hadn't heard in 5 long years. The immediate threat was over. Sterling had sent 3 men. One was wounded and had fled. One lay dead outside the window, and the third was caught, his fate sealed by the unforgiving justice of the wilderness itself. In the ringing quiet, Jack slowly stood up. The moonlight cast a pale stripe across the floor, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He looked across the room at Leanne. She was still standing by the back wall, the heavy Colt held in both hands, pointed at the floor. Her white dress was smudged with dirt, a streak of gunpowder on her cheek. She was a vision, a warrior angel in the ruins of a battle. He walked toward her, his boots loud on the wooden floor. The world was still too loud, too bright, too much. But as he got closer, all the overwhelming noise seemed to fade until all he could hear was the soft sound of her breathing. He stopped in front of her. He looked at the gun in her hands, then at her face, her eyes wide and dark in the gloom. He reached out, not with a clumsy gesture, but with his right hand, the one that wasn't bleeding. He gently touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away the gunpowder smudge. "Leanne," he said. He spoke her name aloud, hearing the shape and texture of it for the first time. It was a beautiful sound. At his touch, at the sound of her own name spoken by this man, she closed her eyes, and a single tear traced a path through the grime on her face. The bet, the saloon, the danger, it all fell away. In that moment, in the dark, silent aftermath, they were not a gunslinger and his prize. They were just a man and a woman who had saved each other. Weeks passed, and the fierce heat of summer softened into the golden light of late August. The world, for Jack, was a place of constant rediscovery. He would spend hours on the porch, just listening. He learned to distinguish the call of the hawk from the cry of the jay, the rustle of a deer in the brush from the whisper of the wind through the aspen leaves. The sounds that had been a painful, chaotic assault were slowly organizing themselves into a language he had forgotten he knew. His hearing wasn't perfect. There was a constant low hum in his right ear, a permanent echo of the cannon blast, but it was a small price to pay for the return of his world. He and Leanne had ridden to the nearest town with a real sheriff, a day's journey away. They told him a doctored version of the story, about an attempted robbery by known associates of Sterling. The sheriff, a weary man who had seen too much, was not surprised. He took their report, noted the death of one man and the severe injury of another, and sent a wire. Within a week, word came back that Sterling, facing questions about his violent business practices and humiliated by the loss of his men, had sold his interests and moved east. The shadow that had hung over them was gone. The cabin was no longer a place of tense silence. It was filled with quiet conversation. Jack's voice, rough and hesitant at first from years of disuse, grew stronger each day, and Leanne, now that she was safe, began to speak freely. Her English was precise, learned from books, but her voice was the soft, musical sound he had first heard on that terrible night. She told him her story. She was not a princess. She was the daughter of a respected doctor in a coastal province in China, a man who had studied both traditional Eastern medicine and Western surgical techniques. She had been his apprentice. Her father had been killed by pirates during a raid on their village. She was taken, sold to sailors, and eventually ended up in San Francisco, where a man like Sterling could buy a person as a curiosity. The name Princess was a cruel joke, a way for him to inflate her value and emphasize her exoticism. Her medical knowledge, the contents of the lacquered box, was her only inheritance, the one thing they could not take from her. She had been waiting, observing, for a chance to use it, not just to heal, but to survive. One evening they sat together on the porch steps, watching the sun dip below the mountains, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and pink. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. "I never knew a forest could be so loud," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I thought it was silent." She looked at him, a small smile playing on her lips. "Nothing is ever truly silent," she said. "You just have to learn how to listen." He turned his head, the movement still novel, and looked at her. In the soft light of dusk, she was no longer the terrified prize from the saloon. She was his partner, his equal. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. Her skin was soft, but her grip was strong. The bet had been a fool's wager, born of whiskey and pride. But sitting here, with her hand in his and a world of sound all around him, he knew without a doubt that he had won more than he had ever bargained for. He had won everything. The frontier was a place that took and took, demanding a price in blood, sweat, and sanity for every small victory. Yet for Jack and Leanne, it became a place of profound creation. Their story reminds us that strength is often hidden in the quietest corners, and that the deepest wounds can sometimes be healed by the most unexpected touch. What began as a drunken bet in a dusty saloon transformed into a partnership forged in fire and silence, proving that true connection needs no words to begin, only the courage to trust when all seems lost. If their journey from desperation to peace on the rugged frontier resonated with you, show your support by giving this video a like. Share it with a friend who appreciates a story where survival gives birth to love. For more tales of the untamed West and the resilient souls who carved a life from it, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss a story. And now, we want to hear from you. What do you believe was the true turning point for them? The moment he won the bet, or the moment she chose to use her skills to save him? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.